The crack of gunfire split the dawn air over Willow Springs, the sound echoing off the brick buildings of Main Street. Through the golden haze of sunrise, 3 men advanced down the dusty road, revolvers drawn. Their target, the modest general. Store at the edge of town, its weathered sign reading, Parker's Provisions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Come on out, Mrs. Parker, the lead man called, his voice carrying a mocking edge. We just want to have a friendly chat about your overdue payments. Behind the store's counter, Emily Parker's hands moved with practiced precision as she loaded her father's old Colt Navy revolver. Her movements were smooth, automatic. Muscle memory from a life she'd left behind years ago. A life she'd hoped her 10-year-old son would never have to know about. Last warning, the man shouted. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Emily's voice carried clearly through the morning air, steady and controlled. Mr. Graves, I've told you before, this store isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. The response came in the form of shattering glass as a bullet took out one of her front windows. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she sighted carefully through a gap in the shutters, her breath slowing as she focused on her target. That's one, she called out calmly. The next shot won't be at my window. The year was 1878, and Willow Springs, Arizona Territory, was changing. The railroad was coming, bringing with it men like Theodore Graves and his Apache Mining Company. Men who saw opportunity in every patch of land, every struggling business, every moment of desperation they could exploit. My name is Emily Parker. 5 years ago, I was known by a different name in a different territory. Back then they called me Lightning Hand Emily, the fastest gun west of the Mississippi. But that was before Thomas was born, before I promised my late husband I'd give our son a normal life, before I buried my revolvers along with my past and became just another shopkeeper trying to make an honest living. Funny how the past has a way of finding you, no matter how deep you try to bury it. Life in Willow Springs had been simple, peaceful. Even, I bought the general store 3 years ago after Henry passed. It wasn't much, but it was honest work and the town had welcomed us. Thomas helped me stock shelves after school, proud to be the man of the house at such a young age. The regulars all doted on him, bringing him candy and telling him stories. We were building something good here, something clean. Then Theodore Graves and his men rode into town 6 months ago. It started small, the way these things always do. A few businesses were accidentally damaged, mysterious fires that the sheriff couldn't quite explain. Then came the offers, always too low, always delivered with that same snake oil smile. It's for the best, they'd say. Progress is coming, whether you like it or not. One by one, the other shopkeepers gave in. Duelist. Family's hardware store now belonged to Apache Mining. So did the Andersons' livery stable and the Browns' restaurant. Those who refused found themselves facing escalating accidents until they had no choice but to sell. I watched it all from behind my counter, keeping my head down, trying to stay out of it. But every night, after Thomas was asleep, I'd take out my father's old Colt and clean it, the familiar weight in my hands, both comfort and temptation. The railroad's coming, Mrs. Parker, Graves had said during his first visit, examining my shelves with false interest. This whole street will be rebuilt, modern, progressive. You should sell now while you can still get a good price. I'd smiled politely, the same smile I'd given 100 men who thought they could intimidate me. This store feeds half the families in Willow Springs, Mr. Graves. It's not for sale. He'd leaned closer then, dropping the friendly act. Everything's for sale, Mrs. Parker, one way or another. I'd held his gaze, letting just a flicker of my old self show through. He'd stepped back, surprised by whatever he'd seen in my eyes. But he'd recovered quickly, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy before leaving. The trouble started the next day. Deliveries began arriving late, or not at all. Customers reported being warned about the quality of my goods. Then came the vandalism, broken windows, spoiled inventory, mysterious accidents that the sheriff always seemed to arrive too late to investigate. Through it all, I kept my temper. For Thomas's sake, I told myself. He'd never seen that other side of me. Never known his mother as anything but the quiet shopkeeper who read him stories at night and made sure he did his schoolwork. I wanted to keep it that way, but now, watching Graves and his men advance on my store in the early morning light, I knew that time was over. They'd chosen to come at dawn, thinking to catch me off guard. They didn't know I hadn't slept, that I'd been expecting this ever since I'd refused their final offer yesterday. Thomas was safely away, spending the night at the Reverend Mitchell's house with his son. I'd arranged it carefully, knowing what was coming. Just like I'd arranged for Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house to watch him if anything happened to me. The familiar calm settled over me as I checked my father's Colt one last time. The gun felt right in my hand, like greeting an old friend. 5 years of peace had done nothing to dull the skills I'd spent a lifetime honing. Some things, once learned, become part of who you are. Mrs. Parker, Graves called out again, closer now. Don't make us come in there. Think about your boy. What'll happen to him if something unfortunate befalls his mother? The threat to Thomas cleared any remaining doubt from my mind. My son would not grow up in a town controlled by men like Graves. It was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. I moved to the door, my steps silent from years of practice. Through the gap in the shutters, I could see Graves and his men clearly now. 3 of them, spread out in a standard firing line. Graves in the middle, flanked by his usual thugs, brothers by the look of them, both wearing gun belts that had seen too much use. They were professionals, I noted clinically. The way they moved, the way they handled their weapons. These weren't just local tough men. They'd been brought in specifically for this kind of work. In my previous life, I might have even crossed paths with them. That thought brought a grim smile to my face. If they had known me from before, they wouldn't be standing so casually in the open. "Last chance, Mrs. Parker," Graves announced. "Come out now, sign the papers, and everybody lives." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar stillness settle over me. Time seemed to slow, just like it used to in the old days. Every detail became crystal clear. The early morning light on their guns, the way their shadows stretched across the street, the slight tremor in the younger brother's gun hand that told me he was the weak link. "Mr. Graves," I called out, my voice carrying the E. Same tone I'd used in a dozen showdowns across 3 territories. "I'm only going to say this once. Leave now, while you still can." They laughed, of course, they always did. To them I was just a widow running a small-town store, someone to be bullied and pushed around. They had no way of knowing that before. I was Mrs. Parker. Before I was even Emily Morrison, I'd been known by another name entirely, a name that still made hardened gunmen check their holsters and hurry past. "Time's up," Graves declared, raising his revolver toward my door. "Boys, let's show the lady what happens to people who don't understand progress." My finger tensed on the trigger, but a voice from my past whispered in my memory. My father's voice from long ago in Texas. "The quickest draw isn't always the smartest one, Emily. Sometimes you need to let your opponent show their hand first." So I waited, watching through the gap as the morning sun caught the silver handle of Graves' revolver. The younger brother shifted nervously, his eyes darting between the store's windows. The older one maintained his position, but I noticed how his free hand kept touching the scar that ran down his left cheek, a tell that spoke of underlying anxiety. That's when I caught movement in the reflection of Anderson's broken shop window across the street. A 4th man, trying to circle around to my store's back entrance. Amateur mistake. They didn't know I'd boarded up that door days ago after spotting one of Graves' men studying it too intently. I'd learned to plan for moments like this during my years riding with the U.S. Marshals in Texas. Back then, I was part of a special unit that went after the worst outlaws in the territory. We were an experiment. Female deputies, chosen because criminals didn't expect us, wouldn't suspect that the pretty young lady asking for directions could outdraw the fastest gun in their gang. I was 19 when Marshal David Harrison recruited me. He'd seen me win a shooting competition in Dallas, beating men twice my age. "You've got a gift, girl," he'd said. "Question is, what are you going to do with it?" For 3 years, I did plenty with it. Helped bring down the Carter gang, stopped the Richmond train robbers, earned my nickname during a shootout with the infamous Jesse Thorne. Lightning Hand Emily, they called me, though few lived to spread the tale. Then I met Richard Parker, a quiet shopkeeper who saw past the legend to the woman beneath, who made me believe I could be something more than just a fast gun. We married, settled down, and had Thomas. I packed away my badges and guns, buried that part of myself deep inside. Richard died of fever 3 years ago, never knowing the full truth about my past. I'd wanted to tell him so many times, but the right moment never came. Now, watching Graves and his men advance on the life I'd built, I wondered if keeping that secret had been a mistake. A sharp crack echoed through the street as the fourth man kicked at my back door. The sound was followed by a muffled curse. He'd discovered the reinforced oak boards I'd installed. The noise made the younger brother jump, his gun jerking sideways. "Careful now, Billy," Graves drawled. "Don't want any accidents." Yet, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Billy. The name clicked in my memory. Billy and Frank Carson, the notorious Carson brothers, from Colorado. I'd heard whispers about them, hired guns who specialized in convincing reluctant property owners to sell. Their reputation for brutality was well earned. That explained why Graves seemed so confident. The Carson brothers weren't just thugs. They were experienced killers who'd left a trail of widows and orphans across 3 territories. In my old life, they would have been prime targets for the marshals. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a former marshal turned shopkeeper, facing down 2 men I would have once hunted. Life had a strange way of coming full circle. "Mrs. Parker," Graves tried again, his tone dripping with false concern. "Think about Thomas. Boy needs his mother. Would be a shame if he had to go to that orphanage in Prescott. The mention of my son's name in Graves' mouth made something cold and deadly stir inside me. I'd buried Lightning Hand Emily for Thomas's sake and tried to give him a normal life, but these men were threatening that very life, and they'd made their biggest mistake by bringing my son into it. My mind was already working through the angles, the strategies I'd learned years ago. 4 opponents, 3 in front, 1 behind. The Carson brothers would be the real threat. They'd react on instinct, falling back on years of gunfighting experience. Graves, for all his bluster, was a businessman. He'd freeze for a crucial second when the shooting started. The fourth man was still struggling with the back door, getting frustrated judging by the increasingly violent kicks. They weren't coordinating well, another sign that this crew had been hastily assembled. Graves might have hired famous gunmen, but he hadn't given them time to work as a team. I did a final check of my position. The morning sun would be in their eyes, not mine. The heavy oak counter would provide cover. Most importantly, I had something they didn't. Intimate knowledge of every creaking floorboard, every angle, every shadow in my store. "I'm coming out," I called, letting a tremor of fear enter my voice. "Please, please don't shoot." The brothers exchanged grins. Graves straightened his jacket, already reaching for the papers I'd refused to sign yesterday. None of them noticed how I'd pitched my voice to carry to the back of the store, making sure their fourth man would hear and relax his guard. "Smart choice," Graves said. "See? Civilization is about reasonable people making reasonable decisions." I moved toward the door, making my steps sound uncertain, hesitant. Every motion was calculated to reinforce their assumptions. Just a frightened widow, knowing when to give up. The weight of my father's colt pressed reassuringly against my palm, hidden behind my skirts. 5 years of peace hadn't dulled my skills. If anything, they'd been honed by motherhood. Running a store while raising a son alone required the same kind of awareness, the same ability to track multiple threats and opportunities simultaneously. I'd just been using those skills differently. The lock clicked as I turned it, loud in the morning quiet. Time slowed, just like it used to before a showdown. I could see everything with perfect clarity. The sweat on Billy Carson's temple, the way Frank's gun hand twitched in anticipation, the smug satisfaction on Graves's face. "Here's how this goes," Graves began, but I was already moving. 3 weeks earlier, dawn painted Willow Springs in shades of amber as I arranged the fresh produce outside Parker's Provisions. Each tomato, apple, and potato had its place. The best-looking ones up front, carefully stacked to catch the morning light. It was a simple trick I'd learned from Richard, one of many small details that had helped us build the store into something the town relied on. "Mom!" The Hendersons' order. "It's ready," Thomas called from inside, his voice carrying the eager enthusiasm of youth. At 10 years old, my son took his duties as assistant shopkeeper seriously, approaching each task with the same methodical attention to detail I'd once applied to tracking outlaws. "Double-check the list," I reminded him, smiling at his exasperated sigh. He knew the routine by heart, but I believed in being thorough, just like I believed in checking the store's sightlines every morning, noting any changes in the street that might affect visibility. Old habits die hard. Mrs. Henderson arrived, precisely at 7, just as she had every Tuesday for the past 3 years. Her order was always the same: flour, sugar, coffee, and whatever fruit looked freshest. But she'd linger, sharing the latest town news while I wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "Did you hear about the Johnsons' place?" she asked, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Strange men were watching their farm, making offers way below market value. Sarah Johnson says they claim to represent some mining company." I kept my movements steady, though my mind instantly catalogued this new information. "Apache Mining?" I asked casually, knowing the answer. "That's the one. Same outfit that's been buying up land all around the territory. They say the railroad's incoming, going to change everything." She shook her head. "Change isn't always for the better, if you ask me." Thomas emerged from the storeroom, carrying a crate of canned goods with careful determination. I watched him work, pride mixing with an ever-present concern. He had Richard's gentle nature, his father's way of seeing the best in people. But there was something else in him too, something that came from my side. A quiet intensity, an ability to read situations that sometimes startled me. "Those men were at the schoolhouse yesterday," he mentioned casually, arranging the cans with precise movements. "Just watching. Teacher sent us inside early." My hands stilled for just a moment. "Did they speak to anyone?" "No, ma'am, but Jimmy Wells says his pa was visited by them last night. Says they're offering to buy all the farms north of town." I shared a look with Mrs. Henderson. We both knew what that meant. Apache Mining wasn't just buying random properties. They were systematically acquiring everything along the proposed railroad route. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Regular customers came and went, each transaction accompanied by snippets of conversation that painted a picture of a town on edge. Every story involved Apache Mining, their offers, their pressure tactics, their promises of progress and prosperity. Around noon, Sarah Cooper, the schoolteacher, stopped by. She was young, barely 25, but carried herself with the quiet authority of someone used to managing a room full of children. More importantly, she was observant, Nothing happened in Willow Springs that Sarah didn't notice. "Emily," she said, selecting an apple with careful consideration, "have you given any thought to that teaching position we discussed? The children could benefit from your mathematics lessons. It was an old conversation, one we'd been having since she discovered my ability with numbers. I'd helped Thomas with his schoolwork one day, explaining complex calculations in a way that made them accessible. Sarah had been impressed, not knowing that those same skills had once helped me calculate bullet trajectories and estimate distances in far less peaceful circumstances. "The store keeps me busy," I replied, the familiar excuse comfortable on my tongue. "Besides, I'm not sure I'm cut out for teaching." Sarah's eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes I wondered if she saw more than she let on. "You sell yourself short, Emily. You have knowledge worth sharing." As she left, I noticed two men lounging across the street pretending to read newspapers while studying my store. They were new in town, their clothes too fine for ordinary travelers. One wore his gun belt low, tied down in a way that spoke of professional experience. Thomas noticed them too. I saw him tense slightly, his movements becoming more deliberate. He'd inherited my instincts, though he didn't know their source. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe we should close early today." I ran my hand through his dark hair, so like his father's. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just some new customers we haven't met yet." But I made sure he stayed inside for the rest of the afternoon, away from the windows. When school let out, I asked Sarah to walk him home, making an excuse about inventory that needed counting. Once they were gone, I locked the front door and went to the storeroom. Behind stacks of flour barrels, hidden beneath loose floorboards, lay a wooden box I hadn't opened in years. The key hung on a chain around my neck, alongside Richard's wedding ring. The box's hinges protested slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lay pieces of my past. A U.S. Marshal's badge, its silver star still gleaming. Letters of commendation signed by judges and governors. Newspaper clippings about Lightning Hand Emily, the female deputy who'd brought justice to the territories. Beneath it all, in a custom holster Richard had never known about, rested my special revolver. Not my father's Colt that I kept for store protection, but the modified Smith & Wesson that had earned me my nickname. I'd had it custom-made in St. Louis, perfectly balanced, with a hair trigger and special grips fitted to my hand. I didn't take it out. Not yet. But I needed to know it was there. Needed to feel its weight, even through the floorboards. Because something was coming to Willow Springs. Something that smelled of greed and gunpowder and old violence. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I served customers, ordered supplies, managed the books, all the normal tasks that made up a shopkeeper's life. But my mind kept returning to those men across the street, to the stories of Apache mining's methods in other towns. As evening approached, Reverend Mitchell stopped by with his son Luke, Thomas's best friend. The Reverend was one of the few people in town who knew pieces of my past, though not the full story. He'd helped me settle in after Richard's death, made sure the town accepted the widow and her son. "Emily," he said, his voice pitched low while the boys explored the candy jars. "There's talk of a town meeting tomorrow night. Apache Mining's representatives want to present their plans for development." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Will you attend?" "Someone should bear witness." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "These men, they're not what they seem. I've heard things from other towns about accidents that happen to those who don't cooperate. I've heard similar stories." His eyes met mine, serious beneath his gentle exterior. "The sheriff won't help. He's already taken their money." "I know." I'd seen the new horse Sheriff Taylor was riding far too fine for a lawman's salary. "If trouble comes," he began, "then we'll face it," I finished. "This town's worth fighting for." He studied me for a moment, perhaps seeing something of the person I used to be. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, it is." Later that night, after Thomas was asleep, I sat at our small kitchen table cleaning my father's Colt. The familiar routine was soothing. Check the cylinder, oil the mechanism, ensure everything moved smoothly. Through the window, I could see the men still watching the store, now sharing a bottle between them. My fingers moved automatically through the maintenance routine, while my mind worked through scenarios. Apache mining was moving faster now, more aggressively. They'd bought or pressured most of the surrounding farms, had started acquiring businesses in town. My store's location, right at the proposed railroad junction, made it particularly valuable. They'd make an offer soon. When I refused, they'd move to threats, then to action. A floorboard creaked behind me. "Mom!" Thomas stood in the doorway, sleep-tousled and concerned. "I had a bad dream." I quickly covered the gun with a cloth. "Come here, sweetheart." He curled into my lap, though he was really getting too big for it. "I dreamed about Dad," he said quietly, "and about bad men coming to take our store." I held him close, breathing, in the scent of soap and innocence. "No one's going to take our store, Thomas, I promise, because you'll protect us. Like you protected me from Billy Jenkins when he was bullying me." I smiled, remembering that incident. Billy Jenkins had been the town bully until the day he'd pushed Thomas down. I'd confronted his father with such controlled intensity that the boy had never caused trouble again. The other parents had attributed it to a mother's protective instinct. They hadn't recognized the steel underneath, hadn't known they were seeing Lightning Hand Emily wearing a shopkeeper's apron. "That's right," I assured him. "No one's going to hurt us." He was quiet for a moment. "Mom, sometimes you look different. When you think I'm not watching, like you're waiting for something." My heart skipped. Had he seen more than I realized? "What do you mean? Like now? You look ready, the way Mr. Anderson's hunting dog looks when it spots a rabbit." I forced myself to relax, to become just his mother again. "I'm always ready to protect you, Thomas. That's what mothers do." He accepted this, but I could tell he was still thinking. My son was observant, perhaps too observant, just like I'd been at his age. After I tucked him back into bed, I returned to the kitchen. The men across the street were gone, but fresh cigarette butts on the ground showed where they'd stood. They'd be back tomorrow, probably with others. Probably with offers and threats wrapped in civilized words. I finished cleaning the Colt and loaded it carefully. Then I went to check the store's defenses. Reinforced shutters, strong locks, clear lines of sight. Everything a careful shopkeeper might do for protection. And if my preparations went beyond normal precautions, if certain floorboards could be lifted to reveal old tools of a trade I'd left behind, well, a mother had to be prepared, especially when storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor before dawn. Margaret Wilson, who ran the telegraph office, knocked urgently at our back door. Her usual composed demeanor was shaken, grey hair escaping its typical tight bun. "Emily," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "you need to see this." She pressed a telegram copy into my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "It came through late last night. They don't know I made a copy." The message was brief. "Addressed to Theodore Graves at the Apache Mining Company. Proceed with acquisitions. Stop use whatever force necessary. Stop Railroad Commission votes next month. Stop timing critical. Stop eliminate resistance by any means. Stop." "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice barely audible. "They've been sending coded messages, something about specialists arriving from Denver, men with certain skills." I studied Margaret's face, noting the fear beneath her professional exterior. "Thank you. This was risky." She straightened her spine. "My Harold didn't die defending this town during the Apache raids just to see it handed over to thieves in suits." She hesitated. "Emily, there's talk about you. They've been asking questions, sending telegrams to other territories." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "About your past before you came here." She touched my arm. "Whatever they find, you've been good to this town. Remember that." After she left, I added the telegram to my hidden box, mind racing through implications. They were accelerating their timeline, which meant mistakes were more likely. Professional gunmen getting rushed into position wouldn't have time to learn the terrain, establish proper coordination. I spent the morning teaching Thomas the store's inventory system, showing him how to track supplies and predict what we'd need. It wasn't just business knowledge. I was teaching him to think ahead, to plan, to recognize patterns. The same skills that had once helped me anticipate outlaw movements could keep a store profitable. "See how the miners buy more coffee before each shift change?" I explained, "and how ranch hands stock up on tobacco after paydays. Knowing your customers' habits helps you serve them better." He nodded seriously, making notes in his careful handwriting. "Like how Mrs. Anderson always buys extra sugar before church socials, or how Mr. Peterson gets liniment for his leg when the weather's changing." "Exactly." I smiled, proud of his observation skills. Details matter. The bell above the door chimed. A man entered, expensively dressed, city clothes that hadn't yet gathered trail dust. Behind him, two others took positions near the entrance, trying to look casual and failing. "Mrs. Parker." The well-dressed man smiled, all smooth charm and practiced ease. "I'm Theodore Graves, Apache Mining Company. I wonder if we might discuss a business opportunity." Thomas tensed beside me, but I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Thomas, why don't you go help Mrs. Henderson with her delivery? She'll be waiting." He hesitated, showing that protective streak that sometimes broke my heart. Even at 10, he tried to be the man of the house. "You sure, Mum?" "Quite sure." I met his eyes, letting him see my confidence. "Everything's fine." Once he'd gone, I turned to Graves. "My store isn't for sale, Mr. Graves." He chuckled, examining a display of canned goods. "Direct. I appreciate that. But you haven't heard my offer. The price doesn't matter." "Everything has a price, Mrs. Parker. Everything and everyone." He set down the can, his manner shifting subtly. "You have a fine boy. It would be a shame if anything happened to your business. Children need stability, security." The threat was clear, wrapped in civilized words. 5 years ago, I would have already had my hand on my gun, but I was a different person now, or at least I was trying to be. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Graves?" He spread his hands, all innocence. "Simply stating facts. Progress is coming to Willow Springs. The railroad will change everything. Smart folks are selling now, getting good prices. Others—" He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen. Businesses fail. Sometimes people have to leave town suddenly." I met his gaze steadily. "Is that what happened in Silver City, in Prescott, all those accidents that cleared the railroad's path?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe respect. He hadn't expected me to know about those places. "You've done your research. Good. Then you know how this ends. Save yourself some grief, Mrs. Parker. Take the offer." "No." He studied me for a long moment. "You're not what I expected. Most widows in your position jump at the chance to sell. Most widows haven't seen your kind before, Mr. Graves. Men who think money gives them the right to take whatever they want." "Careful, Mrs. Parker." His voice hardened. "You have a good reputation in this town. It would be a shame to see that change. People might start asking questions about where you came from, about your past." I smiled, letting just a touch of steel show through. "Asking questions can be dangerous, Mr. Graves. Sometimes you learn things you wish you hadn't." The threat landed. I saw it in the way his eyes narrowed, in how his men shifted their stances. He recognized something in me then, something that didn't fit with the quiet widow running a general store. "Think about my offer," he said finally. "You have until the end of the week. After that—" He adjusted his coat. "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that." After they left, I did a quick inventory of my options. The store's defenses were solid, but they weren't meant to withstand a determined assault. I had friends in town, but most would be too afraid to stand against Apache mining openly. Then there were my own skills, rusty perhaps, but not forgotten. The question was whether I could use them without exposing my past, without destroying the life I'd built for Thomas. Sarah Cooper arrived. As I was closing up, her face tight with concern. "Emily, you need to see this." She handed me a newspaper from Denver. The headline caught my eye. "Apache mining expansion continues. Opposition faces mysterious setbacks." The article detailed a pattern of accidents, fires, and sudden property sales across the territory. But it was the smaller story below that made my blood run cold. Noted gunman Carson brothers leave Colorado. Destination unknown. "The Carson brothers," Sarah said quietly. "They're famous in Denver. Hired guns who specialize in persuasion." I remembered them from my martial days. We'd never crossed paths directly, but I knew their reputation. Fast, skilled, and utterly ruthless. The kind of men who wouldn't hesitate to burn down a store with people inside. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "Luke overheard his father talking to the sheriff. Apache mining's bringing in more men. They're not just buying the town, Emily. They're preparing for something bigger." I walked her to the door, mind already shifting into old patterns, assessing threats and planning responses. "Sarah, if anything happens, there's a letter on my desk. Make sure Thomas gets it." She gripped my hand. "Nothing's going to happen. We won't let it." But we both knew that wasn't true. Something was coming to Willow Springs, something that couldn't be stopped with kind words and good intentions. The only question was whether I could face it without becoming the person I'd left behind. The Carson brothers arrived on a Tuesday, riding impressive black stallions down Main Street like harbingers of coming darkness. I watched them through my store window, noting how other townspeople hurried to clear their path. Even those who didn't know their reputation could sense the danger they carried. Billy Carson, the younger one, couldn't have been more than 25. He had a boy's face but old eyes, the kind that had seen too much violence too young. Frank the elder was harder to read. A scar ran down his left cheek, and his gun hand never strayed far from his holster. They took rooms at the Grand Hotel, the only place in Willow Springs that Apache mining's men would consider suitable. Within hours, the whispers started. Stories about their reputation in Colorado, about the trail of widows and burning buildings they'd left behind. "Did you see their guns?" Thomas whispered that evening as we closed the store. "They're pearl-handled, like in the dime novels." I kept my voice casual while checking the door locks. "Fancy weapons don't make a man dangerous, Thomas. It's how they use them that matters." He was quiet for a moment, arranging canned goods with careful precision. "Jimmy Wells says they're here because of the mining company. Says his pa heard. They're going to run people off their land." My hands stilled on the locks. "What else did Jimmy say?" "That his pa's thinking of selling. Says everyone will have to eventually." He looked up at me, worry creasing his young face. "We're not selling." "Are we, Mom?" "No, sweetheart. This store was your father's dream. It's our home." But later that night, after Thomas was asleep, I pulled out my hidden box again. The modified Smith & Wesson seemed to gleam in the lamplight, calling to a part of myself I'd tried to bury. I didn't remove it from its holster, but I ran my fingers along the familiar curves, remembering a knock at the back door startled me. Deputy Mark Wilson, Margaret's nephew and one of the few honest lawmen left in town, stood there looking troubled. "Emily," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder, "you need to hear this. The sheriff's deputized the Carson brothers." Cold settled in my stomach. With badges, they'd have official authority behind their actions. Any violence could be claimed as lawful enforcement. "There's more," Mark continued. "They've been asking questions about you, about where you came from, your life. Before Willow Springs, I kept my expression neutral. What kind of questions? Sending telegrams to Texas mostly. Something about the marshal's office there." He shifted uncomfortably. "Emily, if there's anything I should know." "Nothing that matters now," I assured him. But my mind was racing. They were digging into my past, which meant time was running. Out the next morning brought more changes. New men appeared in town, tough-looking drifters who clustered around the saloon. They carried their guns openly, badges pinned to their vests. More of Apache Mining's deputies. I sent Thomas to school, with extra precautions, making him promise to stay close to Sarah Cooper. The schoolteacher had proven herself a fierce protector of her students, and more importantly, she was smart enough to recognize danger. Mid-morning, Frank Carson entered my store. He browsed casually, picking up items and setting them down with deliberate slowness. Other customers quickly found reasons to leave. "Fine establishment you have here, Mrs. Parker," he drawled, examining a display of tobacco. "Shame if anything happened to it." I continued arranging inventory, keeping my movements calm and measured. "Was there something specific you needed, Deputy?" He smiled, the scar on his cheek twisting. "Just admiring your stock, though I couldn't help but notice some irregularities." Irregularities. Health. Codes, safety regulations. Railroads coming, Mrs. Parker. Modern times require modern standards. He picked up a can, studied it. "Sheriff's very concerned about public safety. Might need to conduct some inspections." The threat was clear enough. They'd use any pretext to pressure me, to force a sale. I'd seen similar tactics in other towns during my marshal days. "Your concern for public safety is touching," I replied evenly. "Though I can't help wondering why it doesn't extend to the saloon. I hear there's been quite a bit of violence there lately." His eyes narrowed. Something in my tone must have caught his attention. "You've got spirit, Mrs. Parker. Most widows in your position would be more cooperative." "Most widows in my position haven't seen your kind before." He studied me then, really looked at me for the first time. I kept my stance relaxed, but my hands remained in view on the counter. "An old habit, letting a potential threat see you weren't reaching for a weapon while staying ready to move if needed. You know," he said slowly, "you remind me of someone. A woman I heard about back in Texas. It's a really interesting story." "I'm just a shopkeeper, Deputy." "Maybe." He moved toward the door, but paused. "Thing about the past, Mrs. Parker, it has a way of catching up to folks, especially folks who try to bury it." After he left, I did a quick inventory of the store's defenses. The back door's reinforcements were solid, but the windows were vulnerable. The second floor had good sight lines of the street, but limited escape routes. Sarah Cooper stopped by during her lunch break, her face tight with worry. "The Carson brothers visited the school this morning, said they were conducting a safety inspection, but they spent most of the time watching the children, your Thomas especially." My hands clenched on the counter. "Did they speak to him?" "No. I made sure of that." Her voice hardened. "But Emily, this isn't just about property anymore. They're trying to intimidate everyone who might stand against them." She was right. Apache Mining wasn't just buying land. They were buying power, authority, the very fabric of law and order. The telegram Margaret had shown me proved they were working on a deadline, which made them dangerous. "The town meeting tonight," Sarah continued. "They're going to announce their plans for modernization, more like their plans for taking over completely." I nodded, already thinking ahead. The meeting would show who stood where, who might be counted on if things turned ugly. "Will you watch Thomas for me? I need to attend, but I don't want him there." "Of course." She hesitated. Emily, I've been meaning to ask. That day when Billy Jenkins was bullying Thomas, the way you handled his father, where did you learn to be so commanding? I kept my expression neutral. Every mother knows how to protect her child. Maybe. But most mothers don't make grown men back down with just a look. She studied me carefully. Sometimes when you think no one's watching, you move differently, like someone used to handling trouble. Sarah, I'm not asking for explanations, she cut in. Just, if things get bad, if you need help, remember you're not alone. The rest of the afternoon passed tensely. More of Apache Mining's men arrived, taking up positions around town like pieces on a chessboard. They were preparing for something, but what? An hour before closing, Margaret Wilson rushed in, her face pale. "Another telegram," she whispered, pressing a paper into my hand. "They're bringing in more men." But that's not the worst part. The message was brief but clear. Carson Brothers confirm suspicions. Stop Parker woman, possibly former marshal. Stop eliminate threat. Immediately stop no witnesses. Stop my blood ran cold. They knew, or at least suspected, all my careful planning, all my attempts to build a new life, and now it was unraveling. "There's something else," Margaret added. "I overheard the Carson brothers talking. They're not just here for the railroad. Apache Mining's found silver in the hills north of town, rich deposits. They're not buying property for the railroad. They're securing mining rights." The pieces clicked into place. The railroad wasn't the goal. It was just a convenient excuse. The real prize was underground, and Apache Mining was willing to destroy the whole town to get it. I thanked Margaret and sent her away quickly. Then I went to my hidden box and removed the modified Smith & Wesson. The weight felt familiar in my hand, like greeting an old friend, or maybe awakening a sleeping dragon. The town meeting would start soon. Graves and his men would make their announcements, lay out their plans, pretend everything was legal and proper. But now I knew the truth. And more importantly, they knew about me. The question was, what would they do with that knowledge? Would they move against me immediately, or wait to see if I exposed myself first? Either way, time was running out. I could feel it in the air, in the way the town had gone quiet, like nature itself holding its breath before a storm. Soon I would have to make a choice. Remain Emily Parker, the quiet shopkeeper, or become Lightning Hand Emily once more. The sound of horses outside drew my attention. Through the window, I saw Billy Carson riding past, leading a string of mounted men. They were positioning themselves around town, cutting off escape routes. They weren't just preparing for resistance, I realized. They were preparing for a purge. Anyone who wouldn't sell, anyone who might cause trouble, they meant to eliminate all opposition in one night. The town meeting would be the perfect opportunity. Everyone gathered in one place, unarmed, unsuspecting. A fire could start, panic could break out, accidents could happen. By morning, Apache Mining would own everything they wanted, and any witnesses would be silenced. I checked my father's Colt, then strapped on the Smith & Wesson beneath my shawl. The weight of both guns was reassuring, like armor against the coming storm. But was I ready to become that person again, to let my son see who his mother really was? The sun was setting as I left the store, casting long shadows down Main Street. In the fading light, I could see more of Apache Mining's men taking up positions, their badges glinting dully. They were ready for trouble. What they weren't ready for was me, because while they'd been investigating Emily Parker, while they'd been preparing to deal with a possible former marshal, they'd forgotten something crucial. They'd forgotten that Lightning Hand Emily had never lost a gunfight, and she wasn't about to start now. The walk to the town hall gave me time to observe their preparations more carefully. Apache Mining's men had positioned themselves strategically. 2 on the bank's roof, 3 near the livery stable, more scattered among the gathering townspeople. They were establishing firing positions, I realized, preparing for every contingency. At the church, Reverend Mitchell caught up with me, his usual calm demeanor strained. "Emily," he whispered, matching my pace, "I've sent Luke and Thomas to my sister's farm outside town. Sarah Cooper's with them." I nodded, grateful for his foresight. "You've noticed their positioning, like soldiers preparing for battle." His voice carried the weight of experience. He'd served as a chaplain during the war. "The Carson brothers spent an hour in the church this afternoon, claiming to admire the architecture. They were really studying sightlines, planning firing positions." "How many of our people can we count on?" He understood my meaning. "Maybe 20 who'd stand firm, more who'd help quietly, but Emily," he hesitated, "there's talk about your past. Rumors are spreading. Let them talk." We reached the town hall steps. Sometimes rumors can work in our favor. Inside, the meeting hall was already crowded. I recognized faces from my martial days, people who tried to appear strong while fear danced in their eyes. The air felt thick with tension, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Judge Harrison, recently appointed by Apache Mining's influence, stood at the podium. Theodore Graves sat nearby, projecting casual confidence. The Carson brothers flanked the entrance, checking everyone who entered. I chose a seat with clear views of both exits, noting which townspeople positioned themselves similarly. Old Mark Anderson, the blacksmith, had his warhammer propped casually against his chair. The Wilson brothers, both experienced hunters, had spread out to cover different angles. A movement caught my eye. Martha Jenkins, Billy's mother, slipping something to Rebecca Foster. They were passing the word, I realized. The women of Willow Springs had their own network, their own ways of preparing for trouble. Graves stood to speak, his voice carrying that practiced charm. "Friends and neighbors, we're here to discuss progress. The future of Willow Springs hangs in the balance." As he outlined Apache Mining's plans, I studied the room's dynamics. More of their men had filtered in, taking up strategic positions. They were surrounding us, I realized, preparing to control any resistance. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd focused their attention on the obvious threats, the men they thought might fight back. They'd overlooked the women, the shopkeepers, the quiet ones who saw everything. Judge Harrison began reading proclamations, new ordinances giving Apache Mining's deputies broader powers, regulations that would force businesses to sell, legal theft wrapped in official language. I caught Margaret Wilson's eye across the room. She gave a slight nod, the signal we'd arranged. Our own preparations were ready. Letters had been sent to newspapers in 3 territories, documents detailing Apache Mining's methods safely delivered to federal marshals. Frank Carson shifted position, moving to block the side exit. His brother mirrored him at the main doors. They were preparing to trap us all in here, I realized. Whatever they planned would happen soon. My fingers brushed the Smith & Wesson hidden beneath my shawl. The familiar grip seemed to pulse with energy, awakening instincts I'd suppressed for years. Part of me mourned the quiet life I was about to lose, but a deeper part thrilled at the approaching confrontation. Graves was announcing their plans for modernization, tearing down existing buildings, forcing out small businesses, reshaping the town to serve the mining operations. But beneath his words, I heard the truth Margaret had uncovered. This wasn't about progress or the railroad. This was about silver, about greed, about men who would destroy anything that stood between them and riches. The sun had set fully now, casting the room in lamplight that created shifting shadows. Perfect conditions for what they planned. Enough darkness to mask their actions, enough light to target specific threats. I caught Reverend Mitchell's eye, saw him touch his collar in our prearranged signal. Thomas was safely away, along with other children they'd marked as potential hostages. Whatever happened next, the innocent would be protected. Billy Carson's hand kept straying to his gun as Graves spoke, eager for violence. His brother maintained better control, but I could read the anticipation in his stance. They weren't just hired guns. They were attack dogs straining at the leash. The moment approached. I could feel it in the air, in the way Apache mining's. Men subtly shifted positions. They'd wait for Graves to finish speaking, let him maintain the illusion of legality. Then the accidents would begin. But they didn't know about the defensive measures we'd prepared. They hadn't noticed the strengthened window shutters, the strategically placed barrels that could provide cover, the routes of escape we'd arranged, through connected buildings. Most importantly, they didn't know they faced more than just frightened townspeople. They didn't know that Lightning Hand Emily had spent 5 years teaching others her skills, passing on knowledge wrapped in innocent lessons about store security and home defense. The time for hiding was over. Tonight, they would learn what happened when you threatened a mother's child, when you pushed a peaceful town too far. Tonight, Lightning Hand Emily would ride again, not alone this time, but backed by a community ready to fight for their homes. Graves reached the end of his speech, pausing for dramatic effect. In that moment of silence, I felt the weight of my past and present merge into something new. I was still Emily Parker, loving mother and respected shopkeeper, but I was also Lightning Hand Emily, defender of justice and protector of the innocent. The Cousin brothers would learn too late that they weren't the only ones who knew how to handle a gun, and Theodore Graves would discover that some things, like a mother's love and a town's spirit, couldn't be bought or bullied into submission. The town meeting erupted into chaos when the first shot pierced the evening air. Not from inside the hall as everyone expected, but from the street, a single sharp crack that shattered the facade of civility Apache mining had carefully constructed. "Fire!" someone screamed. Through the windows, orange flames illuminated the darkening sky. Parker's provisions, my store, was burning. Graves's smile never wavered as he watched my reaction. He'd planned this, I realized. The meeting wasn't just about intimidation, it was an alibi, with every prominent citizen gathered here who could be blamed for the destruction of my business. "Tragic accident," he said smoothly, raising his voice over the commotion. "These old buildings, so many fire hazards. Perhaps now you'll reconsider my offer, Mrs. Parker." The townspeople stirred uneasily, caught between concern and fear. They'd seen this pattern before: mysterious fires, convenient accidents, property suddenly available at bargain prices. But Graves had miscalculated. The store wasn't just my livelihood. It was where I'd cached weapons, ammunition, and evidence against Apache mining's operations. Evidence now safely removed thanks to Margaret Wilson's warning. "Sheriff," I called out, my voice carrying that old command tone I hadn't used in years. "Aren't you going to investigate this crime?" Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably, his new silver badge gleaming. "Now, Mrs. Parker, let's not jump to conclusions about criminal activity. 3 armed men were seen entering my store 10 minutes ago," Martha Jenkins interrupted, her clear voice surprising everyone. "I saw them myself, carrying oil cans." The shock rippled through the crowd. Martha Jenkins, the banker's wife, always so proper and reserved, openly accusing Apache mining's men. Frank Carson's hand drifted toward his gun. "Careful with those accusations, ma'am. Seeing things in the dark, well, mistakes can happen." I saw them too. Rebecca Foster stood, then Sarah Miller, then others. Women who'd been dismissed as mere housewives revealed themselves as keen observers who documented every suspicious incident. Graves's smile tightened. This wasn't following his script. The quiet townspeople were finding their voices, led by the very women his men had ignored. "My dear ladies," he began, but I cut him off. "Tell me, Mr. Graves." I stepped forward, letting my shawl fall away to reveal my father's Colt. "Did your men check my store's basement before setting the fire?" His expression flickered. He hadn't known about the basement. Few did. It had been Richard's pride, a cool storage space that had taken months to dig. And now, the explosion rocked The town hall, sending everyone diving for cover. The barrels of lamp oil his men had placed in my store had just found the carefully positioned blasting powder in the basement. "You destroyed your own store." Billy Carson's voice held genuine confusion. "No," I replied calmly. "I destroyed your ammunition cache. The one you'd hidden in my basement 3 days ago, thinking I wouldn't notice." That revelation hit like a second explosion. Apache Mining had stored illegal weapons in a civilian business, endangering the entire town. Even their bought and paid for. Sheriff couldn't ignore such a blatant crime. "Now," I continued, my voice carrying that steel edge that had once made outlaws freeze, "let's discuss what else your men have hidden around town. Like the stockpile in the church basement? Or the weapons cached behind the schoolhouse?" The Carson brothers drew their guns with practiced speed, but they found themselves facing not just me, but a dozen armed townspeople. The quiet shopkeepers and farmers had been preparing, watching, waiting for this moment. "Think carefully," I warned them. "Your men are scattered, isolated in small groups. My store wasn't the only place rigged to burn your hidden caches." As if to emphasize my point, another explosion echoed from the direction of the church. Reverend Mitchell had insisted on handling that one personally. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," he'd said with a grim smile. Graves stood, his composure finally cracking. "You're insane. You're destroying your own town." "No, Mr. Graves. We're cleaning it, like lancing a wound to remove the infection." I moved toward him, each step measured and precise. "Now, about those silver deposits you found." His face went pale. "How did you—" "Margaret Wilson isn't the only telegraph operator who believes in justice. We've known about the silver for weeks, just like we know about the falsified railroad documents, the bribes, the coded messages to your investors." The Carson brothers exchanged glances, their professional confidence wavering. They were experienced gunmen, but this wasn't a simple intimidation job anymore. "Mrs. Parker," Frank Carson said slowly, "you're not just some shopkeeper, are you?" "No," Deputy Mark Wilson answered, emerging from the crowd with his badge prominently displayed. "She's a federal marshal, or was, before she retired to raise her son." The revelation rippled through the room. Even those who'd suspected something about my past looked shocked at the confirmation. Lightning hand. "Emily," Billy Carson breathed. Recognition finally dawning. "The woman who brought down the Carter gang. We thought you were dead." Stories of my death were greatly exaggerated. I kept my voice calm, but my mind raced through scenarios. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. It could still explode into violence. Graves reached inside his coat. "This changes nothing. We still have the law on our side. The documents, the contracts are worthless," Judge Harrison interrupted, standing to face him. The real Judge Harrison, not the imposter Apache Mining had installed. "Federal marshals arrived an hour ago. Your pet judge is already in custody." That revelation staggered Graves. His careful plans were unraveling thread by thread, but cornered men are dangerous, and I saw the decision form in his eyes before he moved. "Kill them all!" he screamed, drawing a derringer from his sleeve. "Burn the whole town!" The Carson brothers were professionals. Their guns seemed to materialize in their hands. But I hadn't survived a decade as a marshal by being slow, the smith. And Wesson cleared my skirt as I dove sideways, my first shot catching Billy Carson's gun hand. His bullet whined overhead as Frank tried to track my movement. What followed was chaos, but controlled chaos. The townspeople had practiced for this, had positioned themselves carefully. Apache Mining's men found themselves isolated, cut off from support. Through the gun smoke, I saw Martha Jenkins calmly pick off a gunman with her late husband's rifle. Rebecca Foster and her sewing circle had turned their quilting skills to creating cover, dropping heavy drapes at strategic moments to disorient attackers. But Graves was my target. He'd scrambled behind the podium, firing wildly while shouting orders that his scattered men couldn't follow. "It's over," I called out, my voice You're carrying over the din. Your men are either down or running. The Carson brothers are finished. Surrender now, testify against your employers, and you might see daylight again. His answer was another shot, this one closer. He wasn't a complete amateur. He'd managed to work his way around while I was focused on the brothers. You don't understand, he snarled. The silver deposit is worth millions. We've invested too much to back out now. Even if you stop us, others will come. Others won't have your inside information. Your coded telegrams about the silver discovery are already on their way to every major newspaper in the territory. That stopped him cold. In the business world, he understood, information was power. With his secret exposed, with federal investigators already involved, his investors would abandon the scheme. He stood suddenly. Derringer aimed at my heart. Then I got nothing left to lose. The shot echoed through the hall. Graves looked surprised as he stumbled backward, staring at his smoking gun. He'd fired, but his bullet had gone wide. Mine hadn't. As he fell, I heard movement behind me. Frank Carson, somehow still conscious despite his wounds, trying for one last shot. I spun, the Smith & Wesson flowing through the motion I'd practiced thousands of times. Our eyes met as my finger tightened on the trigger. In that moment I saw him accept his fate, saw him realize he'd finally met someone faster. The impact of my bullet knocked him backward through the hall's window. A fitting exit for a man who'd lived by violence. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of distant fires and the moans of the wounded. Apache Mining's men were dead, captured, or fled into the night. The Carson brothers' reign of terror had ended with a crash of broken glass. Deputy Wilson took charge of securing prisoners, while Martha Jenkins organized care for the injured. The town was battered but unbroken. More importantly, its people had found their strength. I holstered the Smith & Wesson, feeling the familiar weight settle against my hip. After 5 years of playing the quiet widow, I'd worried my skills might have dulled, but some things, once learned, become part of who you are. Marshal, Judge Harrison approached, respect evident in his voice. The federal authorities will want your testimony. Former Marshal, I corrected. I'm just a shopkeeper now. He smiled knowingly. A shopkeeper who just happened to organize a town's resistance and outshoot the infamous Carson brothers? I think your old commission might still have some life in it. Maybe, I allowed. But first, I need to see my son. As I walked out into the cool night air, I thought about Thomas. He'd have questions, would need to understand who his mother really was. But maybe that would be easier now, with the truth finally in the open. Lightning Hand. Emily wasn't just a legend from the past anymore. She was part of me, just as much as being a mother and shopkeeper, and Willow Springs was stronger for having both. The fires were dying down, already being contained by organized bucket brigades. My store's facade was scorched but standing. The explosion had actually protected it, blowing out the flames before they could take hold. Dawn would bring federal marshals, newspaper reporters, and a new chapter for the town. But for now, in this quiet moment between violence and victory, I simply breathed in the night air and thanked whatever fate had led me here. Sometimes the hardest shots aren't the fastest or the most accurate. Sometimes they're the ones that force you to face who you really are, to embrace all the parts of yourself you've tried to hide. I'd taken that shot tonight. We all had. And like every other shot I'd taken in my life, it had hit its mark. The aftermath unfolded like a carefully orchestrated dance. Reverend Mitchell emerged from the church bell tower, where he'd positioned himself as our lookout. His military experience had proved invaluable in coordinating the town's defense. Apache Mining's reinforcements tried to enter from the north. He reported, rifles still smoking. Sarah Cooper's husband and the Wilson brothers convinced them to reconsider. The sound of galloping hooves drew our attention. Deputy Mark Wilson returned with 4 prisoners. Apache mining men who'd attempted to flee with company documents. Found these in their saddlebags. He handed me a leather portfolio. Detailed maps of the silver deposits, ownership records, evidence of claim jumping, even notes about which officials they'd bribed. I examined the papers, recognizing names that would interest the federal authorities. Their investors won't be happy about this becoming public. Margaret Wilson hurried over, her usually pristine appearance disheveled but triumphant. Just received word from the territorial capital. The governor's dispatching troops to secure the area and, she smiled, 3 newspapers are already running stories about Apache mining's corruption. The victory felt solid, but experience had taught me to be thorough. Search every building they've accessed. Check for hidden caches, documents, anything they might have left behind. As the townspeople organized search parties, I noticed Martha Jenkins examining one of the fallen gunman's weapons. Her handling of the rifle showed surprising expertise. "My Harold taught me before he passed," she explained, catching my look. "Said a woman should know how to protect herself. Never thought I'd use those lessons like this." Rebecca Foster emerged from her dress shop, leading a group of women who'd been providing covering fire from upper windows. They'd turned their sewing scissors into makeshift caltrops, scattering them to hinder Apache mining's movements. "Emily," Sarah Cooper approached, her schoolteacher's composure perfectly maintained despite the gunpowder residue on her sleeves. "Thomas is safe at the Mitchell farm, but he saw the explosions. He'll have questions." I nodded, feeling the weight of imminent explanations. "He's old enough to understand. Maybe it's time he knew everything." Billy Carson, nursing his wounded hand in custody, laughed bitterly. "The boy's got lightning hand Emily for a mother. Bet that makes for interesting bedtime stories." "Quiet," Frank Carson silenced his brother. Though captured, he maintained a gunfighter's dignity. "We knew the risks when we took this job. Should have done better research on the town." Judge Harrison supervised as deputies began collecting statements from witnesses. The legal aftermath would be complex, but with federal authorities involved, Apache mining's influence wouldn't protect them. "The territorial governor will want to speak with you," he mentioned. "Your testimony could expose corruption beyond just this town." I watched as townspeople extinguished the last fires, already planning repairs. Willow Springs comes first. These people stood against impossible odds. They deserve justice. Rebecca Foster's youngest daughter appeared with bandages and coffee, showing the same quiet efficiency as her mother. The next generation, I realized, had learned valuable lessons about standing up to tyranny. The silver deposits. Martha Jenkins mused, still holding her rifle with comfortable familiarity. "They'll bring others like Apache mining. Let them come." Sarah Cooper's voice held steel. "We know how to handle them now." She was right. The town had found its strength, had learned to coordinate and resist. More importantly, they'd seen through the veneer of legitimate business to recognize hidden threats. Deputy Wilson approached with fresh news. Found their payroll records, lists of bribes, blackmail material, everything they used to control other towns. "Send copies to every newspaper and law enforcement office in the territory," I instructed. "Make sure this story can't be buried." The horizon was lightening, dawn approaching. Soon, the federal marshals would arrive, bringing official authority and complicated questions, but Willow Springs had already claimed its victory. I surveyed the town hall's battlefield. Bullet holes marked the walls, but they'd become symbols of resistance rather than intimidation. The scattered playing cards from Graves's pocket formed an ironic tableau, his final hand revealed as a losing bluff. "What happens now?" Billy Carson asked from his makeshift cell. "To the town, to all of us?" "Justice happens," I replied. "Real justice, not the kind you and your brother were selling." Frank Carson nodded slowly. "You know, in all our years of gun work, No one ever organized an entire town against us. Should have known something was wrong when the women started watching too carefully. Martha Jenkins smiled primly. We've always watched, Mr. Carson. You men just never noticed. Rebecca Foster's sewing circle had already begun cataloguing damage, planning repairs with the same precision they used for quilting patterns. The town would rebuild, stronger for having faced this test. "Emily," Margaret Wilson called urgently. "Another telegram. The governor's received reports of similar situations in other towns. He's requesting your assistance in investigating." The old familiar pull of duty tugged at me. There were other communities facing their own Apache minings, other people needing protection, but as I watched Thomas running toward me, he must have convinced Sarah to bring him back. I knew my priorities. My son reached me first, followed by the other children returning with their parents. "Mom!" He hugged me tightly, then pulled back to study my face. "You're different. The way you stand, the way you talk." "I'm still me, sweetheart, just all of me now." He nodded, showing that same quiet perception that had always marked him as my son. "Is that why you taught me to watch everything? To remember details?" "Smart boy," I smiled. "Let's go home. I have stories to tell you." The sun created the horizon as we walked, painting Willow Springs in new light. My store would need rebuilding, the town would need healing, and the future would bring fresh challenges, but we'd face them together, this community that had learned to fight back. And if trouble came again, they'd find more than just Lightning Hand Emily waiting. They'd find an entire town ready to stand its ground. As for me, I was finally whole. Mother, shopkeeper, and marshal, all parts of who I truly was. The weight of my guns felt right again, balanced by Thomas's hand in mine, and the future we'd protect together. Some shots change everything, your life, your identity, your whole world. Tonight's shot had restored mine, bringing past and present together in a new beginning, and like every shot I'd ever taken, it had found its mark perfectly. The federal marshals arrived at sunrise, their dust-covered horses testament to a hard night's ride. Leading them was a face I hadn't seen in 5 years, Marshal David Harrison, the man who'd first recruited me in Texas. His weathered features registered surprise, then understanding as he surveyed the scene. "Should have known," he dismounted smoothly. "Only Lightning Hand Emily could turn a whole town into a fighting force." "Just defending our homes, David." I kept my voice neutral, aware of Thomas watching from the store's doorway. Apache mining made the mistake of threatening the wrong community. The next hours passed in a whirlwind of official statements and evidence collection. Harrison's men secured the prisoners, while Judge Harrison began formal depositions. Every townsperson had a story to tell, each one adding to the tapestry of Apache mining's corruption. "Their network goes deeper than we thought," David shared privately, examining the documents we'd seized. "Shell companies, false identities, bribes reaching into the territorial government. This wasn't just about silver, they were building an empire." I noticed his careful study of the town's defenses, the strategic positions we'd established. "Not anymore." "No," he agreed, "though this victory comes with complications. Word spreading about what happened here. Other towns are talking about resistance. The mining companies won't take that lightly." Sarah Cooper joined us, her teacher's portfolio now filled with carefully documented evidence. "They're already retaliating. 3 families outside town just received eviction notices from a bank, suddenly calling in their loans." The familiar anger stirred, but I forced myself to think strategically. The bank president's brother works for Apache Mining's parent company. Start there. David raised an eyebrow. "You've kept your investigative skills sharp." "Had to. Running a store isn't so different from tracking outlaws. You learn to notice patterns, follow supply lines, and understand who's connected to whom." Thomas approached cautiously, carrying a stack of ledgers we'd recovered from Graves's office. My son's natural attention to detail had already proven invaluable in organizing evidence. "Mom," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. Mr. Anderson found more ammunition hidden in the livery stable, different kinds than what Apache Mining's men used. I examined the rounds he'd brought, expensive custom-made ammunition from a manufacturer in St. Louis, the same type used by professional gunmen working for the larger mining consortiums. They were preparing for something bigger, David concluded. Apache Mining was just the first wave. Once they secured the town, others would move in, I finished, using the same tactics but with more resources. Sarah's expression hardened. Then we'll need to be ready. The school can double as a training ground. Most families already send their children to me for lessons. The implications were clear. Under the guise of normal education, she'd help prepare the next generation to defend their homes, just as I'd unconsciously trained Thomas through seemingly innocent lessons about observation and strategy. Marshal Harrison studied the town's layout with fresh eyes. You've fortified key positions, established clear fields of fire. This isn't just a temporary defense. You're preparing for a siege. We're preparing for reality, Rebecca Foster corrected, joining our discussion. Her sewing circle had transformed into an intelligence network, sharing information gathered from customers and travelers. The mining companies won't stop just because one scheme failed. She was right. Apache Mining's defeat would attract attention from more powerful interests. Some would see opportunity in our silver deposits. Others would want to make an example of a town that dared resist. There's talk in Denver, David shared reluctantly. The territorial governor's under pressure from mining interests. They're pushing for new laws about public safety and economic development. Laws that would make it harder for towns to resist corporate takeovers, Judge Harrison added, his judicial experience reading between the lines. They'll try to legalize what Apache Mining attempted by force. The challenge ahead became clear. We'd won the battle, but the real war was just beginning. A war fought with lawyers and legislation instead of guns. Thought violence would always lurk beneath the surface. Thomas absorbed this discussion with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. Like chess, he said suddenly, you taught me to think 3 moves ahead, to watch what the other player's really planning. Pride mixed with concern as I realized how much he'd understood. My son had inherited more than just my strategic mind. He'd developed the same instinct for recognizing threats that had kept me alive as a marshal. Smart boy, David commented. Though this game's more complicated than chess, the mining companies will use every weapon they have. Economic pressure, legal challenges, hired guns disguised as law enforcement. Martha Jenkins arrived with fresh coffee and news from her banking contacts. They're already moving. 3 banks in the territory have suddenly changed ownership, corporations with ties to the mining consortiums. The pattern emerged. They would try to strangle resistant towns financially while building a legal framework to justify their actions. Violence would be their last resort, but it would remain an option. We'll need allies, I concluded. Other towns, honest officials, newspapers willing to expose corruption. Already handled, Margaret Wilson stepped forward, telegrams in hand. I've been connecting with operators throughout the territory. We've established our own communication network, independent of corporate control. The pieces of our defense took shape. Sarah's school would become a center for training and coordination, disguised as normal education. Rebecca's sewing circle would continue gathering intelligence. The church's charitable activities would provide cover for moving supplies and information. What about you? David asked quietly. The territory could use a marshal with your skills, officially this time with a new commission. The offer tempted me. A chance to fight corruption directly, to protect other communities facing similar threats. But Thomas's presence reminded me of my priorities. My place is here, I replied. Willow Springs needs to become more than just one town that got lucky. We need to show others how to defend themselves, how to recognize threats before They become overwhelming. He nodded, understanding. You're building something bigger than just local resistance, a network of communities ready to stand against corporate takeover. More than that, Thomas added, surprising us with his insight. Mom's teaching people. They don't have to be afraid, like she taught me. Sarah smiled at her student's perception. The boy's right. Fear is their best weapon. Once people stop being afraid, start working together, they find their strength, I finished. Apache Mining's mistake wasn't just threatening us. It was showing other towns what's possible when people unite against intimidation. The day continued with a stream of activity. Federal agents catalogued evidence while townspeople repaired damage and strengthened defenses. Through it all, I watched Thomas helping where he could, processing his new understanding of his mother's past. That evening, as the town gathered for a community meal in the church basement, I finally had a moment. Alone with my son, the questions I dreaded came with his usual thoughtful precision. The stories about Lightning Hand Emily, he began. The ones in those dime novels Jimmy Wells reads. They're about you, aren't they? Some of them, I admitted. Though they got most details wrong, made it sound more exciting than it was. He considered this. Is that why you taught me to shoot? To watch people's hands, their eyes? Why did you make me practice remembering details? Partly, I stroked his hair, so like his father's. Knowledge keeps you safe. Understanding how people think, what they're really planning, those skills, matter more than fast guns. Like how you knew Apache Mining was lying about the railroad? How did you saw what they were really doing? Exactly. I smiled at his understanding. Being Lightning Hand Emily wasn't about shooting. It was about protecting people, about standing up to those who prey on the weak. He absorbed this, then asked the question that really mattered. Are you going back to being a marshal? No, sweetheart. I'm still Emily Parker, your mother and a shopkeeper. I just don't have to hide parts of myself anymore. This satisfied him. But his next observation showed how deeply he'd thought about everything. The mining companies will send others, worse than Apache Mining. Yes, I didn't sugarcoat it, but we'll be ready. And this time, we won't have to hide our preparations. The evening ended with the town's women gathering in Rebecca Foster's shop, planning, while their hands stayed busy with mending and craftwork. Martha Jenkins taught basic firearms maintenance disguised as sewing lessons. Sarah Cooper shared techniques for encoding messages in ordinary schoolwork. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The mining consortiums would probe our defenses, testing resolve through economic pressure and legal threats. They'd send men to watch us, to look for weaknesses they could exploit. But Willow Springs was no longer just a small town, hoping to survive. We'd become something more, a symbol of resistance, a model for other communities facing similar threats. As I watched Thomas helping Sarah organize her schoolroom-turned-command center, I realized we'd crossed a threshold. The peaceful life I'd tried to build hadn't been destroyed by revealing my past. It had evolved into something stronger. Lightning Hand. Emily's skills would still serve, but now they'd protect more than just law and order. They'd defend a community's right to determine its own future, free from corporate corruption and hired violence. The sun set on a town, forever changed, yet somehow more itself than ever before. We'd face tomorrow's challenges together, each person contributing their own strengths to our common defense. And if trouble came again, they'd find more than just one legendary gunfighter waiting. They'd face a whole community ready to stand its ground, armed with something more powerful than fast guns, the unshakable strength of people united against injustice. Later that night, after most federal agents had retired to their temporary quarters, I met with a select group in the church basement. The location wasn't just secure, it symbolized the moral authority we'd need in the coming fights. Intercepted 3 more telegrams, Margaret Wilson spread the decoded messages across the table. Mining consortiums are calling emergency meetings in Denver. Our victory has them rattled. Judge Harrison examined the telegrams with a practiced eye. They're coordinating responses. Look at these references to regulatory frameworks and economic stability measures. They'll attack through legislation first. Already happening, Deputy Mark Wilson added. Railroad commissions pushing new rules about essential infrastructure development. Gives corporations power to seize property for any project deemed vital to territorial growth. Rebecca Foster's nimble fingers never stopped working on what appeared to be a quilt as she spoke. My cousin in the territorial capital says they're drafting more bills. Special courts for business disputes, restrictions on local law enforcement, new banking regulations. The pattern became clear. They would try to dismantle community resistance piece by piece, using the law itself as a weapon. There's something else, David Harrison interjected. Reports of unusual troop movements near Fort Richardson. Army patrols are increasing along bandit-troubled areas. Laying groundwork, I recognize the tactic. Creating justification for military intervention if civil authorities can't maintain order. Same strategy they used during the railroad strikes back east. Sarah Cooper's teacher's mind caught the implications. They're rewriting the narrative, making resistance to corporate takeover seem like lawlessness that threatens territorial development. Thomas, who I'd allowed to attend this strategy session, displayed that sharp perception that sometimes startled me. Like how Apache Mining called their gunmen deputies and their threats safety inspections. Reverend Mitchell nodded approvingly at my son's insight. Control the language, control the story, make defenders look like outlaws. Then we changed the story, Martha Jenkins declared. My late husband's printing press still works. We start. Our own newspaper, tell the truth about what's really happening. The idea sparked others. Margaret Wilson's telegraph network could distribute our stories territory-wide. Sarah's students could carry news to their families. Rebecca's sewing circle could spread information through seemingly innocent gossip. Won't just be stories, they'll try to control, David warned. Bank foreclosures, supply line disruptions, pressure on businesses that support resistance. They'll try to isolate and strangle uncooperative towns. Already thought of that, I revealed. While everyone watched the guns, Martha's been quietly arranging alternate supply routes through independent traders. Rebecca's circle has mapped every back road and mountain trail that bypasses corporate-controlled highways. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. You've been preparing for this longer than anyone realized. Since the day Apache Mining arrived, I confirmed. Sometimes the best defense is built before the enemy knows you're building it. Thomas absorbed these lessons with quiet intensity. I saw him mentally cataloging techniques, understanding how seemingly innocent activities could mask serious preparation. We'll need more than just local organization, David pointed out. Other towns will need help setting up their own defenses. Already arranged, Sarah produced a stack of letters. I've been corresponding with teachers throughout the territory, teaching techniques that include lessons about community organization and resistance strategies. Martha Jenkins smiled. And My Ladies' Aid Society has branches in 12 towns. Amazing how much information can be shared during charitable work. The pieces of a larger resistance network emerged. Each group had its role. Sarah's educational network, Martha's printing press, Rebecca's intelligence gathering, Margaret's communications web. All seemingly innocent activities that combined into something powerful. They'll send investigators, Deputy Wilson warned. Professional Pinkertons who know how to spot organized resistance. Let them come. Rebecca's smile held steel. They'll find nothing but women gossiping, children learning, churches helping their communities. Everything is perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary. David studied the emerging plan with professional appreciation. You're not just defending one town. You're creating a model for others to follow, making resistance look so normal, so integrated into daily life that it becomes impossible to root out. Exactly, I confirmed. Apache Mining's mistake was using obvious force. The consortiums will be subtler, so our response must be equally subtle. Hide strength behind seeming weakness, organization behind apparent chaos. Thomas spoke up again, showing he'd inherited my strategic thinking. Like how you taught me to play chess, Mum. Making strong moves look like mistakes until it's too late for your opponent to counter. The night deepened as we refined plans, assigned roles, and established contingencies. Every person there understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Willow Springs anymore. We were creating something new, something that could change the entire territory. Dawn approached when David pulled me aside for a private word. You've built something remarkable here, Emily. More than just resistance. You've created a community that thinks like law enforcement while appearing completely innocent. Had good teachers, I acknowledged. You taught me that the best operations are the ones nobody recognizes as operations. He nodded at Thomas, who had fallen asleep on a church. Pew, your boy understands more than he lets on. Natural investigator's mind, like his mother. He'll need those skills. The world's changing, David. It's not just about fast guns anymore. The real fights happen in bank offices and legislative chambers. But the old skills still matter, he reminded me. Some problems can only be solved with a steady hand and good aim. I touched the Smith & Wesson, concealed but always ready. That's why we're teaching both. The women learning to shoot aren't just preparing for violence. They're understanding how to think tactically, how to recognize threats before they become deadly. The first light of dawn filtered through the church's stained glass, painting the basement in colors that transformed our makeshift command center into something almost sacred. They'll test you soon, David warned. The consortiums will want to make an example of Willow Springs, show other towns that resistance is futile. Let them try. I gathered my sleeping son in my arms, marveling at how he could still seem so innocent despite everything he'd learned. They'll find more than they bargained for. The town stirred to life outside, shopkeepers opening stores, farmers heading to fields, children gathering for school. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, unthreatening. That was our true victory. Not just defeating Apache Mining, but transforming resistance into something as natural as breathing. Every lesson taught, every skill shared, every seemingly innocent gathering added another thread to the unbreakable web we were weaving. The mining consortiums would send their agents, their lawyers, their hired guns. They'd expect to find a town weakened by battle, vulnerable to more subtle pressures. Instead, they'd discover that Lightning Hand Emily's greatest legacy wasn't her speed with a gun. It was teaching an entire community how to stand together. Against injustice, how to fight without seeming to fight at all. The sun rose on a new day in Willow Springs. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that peaceful exterior, a revolution was brewing. Not with bullets and blood, but with quiet determination and unshakable unity. The real war was just beginning, and we intended to win. The mining consortium's first move came not with violence, but with money. A week after Apache Mining's defeat, the Territorial Bank suddenly called in loans on 3 farms north of town. The same day, merchants in Denver canceled supply contracts with Willow Springs businesses. Economic warfare, Judge Harrison observed, as we gathered in my partially rebuilt store. They're trying to strangle the town financially, but we'd prepared for this. Martha Jenkins activated her banking connections, arranging alternate financing through independent lenders. Rebecca Foster's relatives in San Francisco provided new supply routes. Within days, the pressure eased. They're probing our defenses. I explained to Thomas as we restocked shelves. testing for weaknesses just like in chess. Each move reveals their strategy. He'll need those skills. The world's changing, David. It's not just about fast guns anymore. The real fights happen in bank offices and legislative chambers. But the old skills still matter, he reminded me. Some problems can only be solved with a steady hand and good aim. I touched the Smith & Wesson, concealed but always ready. That's why we're teaching both. The women learning to shoot aren't just preparing for violence. They're understanding how to think tactically, how to recognize threats before they become deadly. The first light of dawn filtered through the church's stained glass, painting the basement in colors that transformed our makeshift command center into something almost sacred. They'll test you soon, David warned. The consortiums will want to make an example of Willow Springs, show other towns that resistance is futile. Let them try. I gathered my sleeping son in my arms, marveling at how he could still seem so innocent despite everything he'd learned. They'll find more than they bargained for. The town stirred to life outside, shopkeepers opening stores, farmers heading to fields, children gathering for school. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, unthreatening. That was our true victory. Not just defeating Apache mining, but transforming resistance into something as natural as breathing. Every lesson taught, every skill shared, every seemingly innocent gathering added another thread to the unbreakable web we were weaving. The mining consortiums would send their agents, their lawyers, their hired guns. They'd expect to find a town weakened by battle, vulnerable to more subtle pressures. Instead, they'd discover that Lightning Hand Emily's greatest legacy wasn't her speed with a gun. It was teaching an entire community how to stand together against injustice, how to fight without seeming to fight at all. The sun rose on a new day in Willow Springs. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that peaceful exterior, a revolution was brewing. Not with bullets and blood, but with quiet determination and unshakable unity. The real war was just beginning, and we intended to win. The mining consortium's first move came not with violence, but with money. A week after Apache Mining's defeat, the Territorial Bank suddenly called in loans on 3 farms north of town. The same day, merchants in Denver canceled supply contracts with Willow Springs businesses. Economic warfare, Judge Harrison observed, as we gathered in my partially rebuilt store. They're trying to strangle the town financially, but we'd prepared for this. Martha Jenkins activated her banking connections, arranging alternate financing through independent lenders. Rebecca Foster's relatives in San Francisco provided new supply routes. Within days, the pressure eased. They're probing our defenses. I explained to Thomas as we restocked shelves. Testing for weaknesses, just like in chess. Each move reveals their strategy. My son nodded thoughtfully, arranging canned goods with tactical precision. That's why you had Mrs. Jenkins talk to other banks months ago. You saw this coming. Smart boy. In this kind of fight, preparation matters more than fast guns. The bell above the door chimed. A well-dressed woman entered, Clara Richardson, wife of a prominent Denver businessman. I recognized her type immediately. Wealthy, refined, and far more dangerous than she appeared. Mrs. Parker, she smiled warmly. I've heard so much about your establishment. Welcome to Willow Springs. I kept my tone neutral while noting her subtle examination of the store's defenses. What brings you to our town? Business opportunities, actually. My husband's investment group sees great potential here. She produced documents from her reticule. We're prepared to make very generous offers on local properties. Before I could respond, Sarah Cooper entered with her students for their daily arithmetic lesson, our cover for teaching young people to recognize and counter corporate tactics. Mrs. Richardson, Sarah's smile held perfect innocence. What? A surprise? I wasn't aware the Richardson Investment Group had interests outside Denver. Clara's composure flickered slightly. She hadn't expected to be recognized, hadn't realized we'd researched every major financial player in the territory. My husband believes in territorial development, she recovered smoothly, bringing prosperity to frontier communities. Like Silver City? Thomas asked innocently, practicing the intelligence-gathering techniques I'd taught him. Jimmy Wells's cousin lived there before the Richardson Group bought the water rights. Another crack in her facade. The Silver City operation had been carefully hidden behind shell companies. A 10-year-old boy shouldn't have known about it. Children hear everything, Sarah commented mildly. It's remarkable what they notice. Clara Richardson departed shortly after, her real mission unfulfilled. She'd come to assess the town's vulnerabilities, gauge our defenses, and identify pressure points. Instead, she'd discovered that Willow Springs was far better informed and organized than anyone had suspected. She'll report back, David Harrison predicted when I told him about the encounter. The consortiums will realize simple economic pressure won't work here. Good, Martha Jenkins said firmly. Let them waste time on failed tactics while we strengthen our position. The next weeks brought more visitors. Attorneys offering to help with property disputes, insurance agents warning about increased risks, reporters asking questions that probed for weaknesses. Each encountered a town that appeared normal on the surface while hiding sophisticated defenses beneath. Sarah Cooper's school became our central organizing point. Children carried messages hidden in arithmetic problems, while parents attended educational meetings that doubled as strategy sessions. The school's reputation for academic excellence provided perfect cover for teaching resistance techniques. Division problem, Sarah would say, drawing on the blackboard. If 3 mining companies control 9 supply routes, how many alternate paths do we need? Her students learned to think strategically while appearing to study mathematics. Thomas excelled at these lessons, showing an intuitive grasp of complex organizational concepts. Rebecca Foster's sewing circle expanded its reach, connecting with women's groups across the territory. They shared more than gossip and patterns. Information about corporate movements, warnings about new tactics, strategies for community defense. Remarkable how a quilting pattern can resemble a tactical map, Rebecca observed one afternoon, showing her latest creation. The intricate design actually depicted safe routes around corporate checkpoints. Even the church evolved, its charitable activities providing cover for distributing supplies and information. Reverend Mitchell's Sunday sermons included subtle messages about resistance and unity, coded in biblical references. David versus Goliath, he'd preach, teaching us that size and strength matter less than preparation and righteous purpose. The mining consortium's frustration showed in increasingly desperate moves. They tried bribing local officials, only to find their agents exposed by Margaret Wilson's telegraph network. Attempts to disrupt supply lines failed against Martha Jenkins' alternative arrangements. They don't understand what they're fighting, Deputy Wilson remarked. They see a small town, but they're actually facing an entire community organized, like a law enforcement operation. He was right. Every shopkeeper, farmer, and housewife had become an intelligence gatherer. Children played games that taught them to spot suspicious behavior. Women's social calls doubled as reconnaissance missions. Thomas thrived in this environment, absorbing lessons about strategy and organization. He helped Sarah Cooper encode messages in schoolwork, assisted Rebecca's circle in mapping corporate movements, even contributed to Martha's banking network by tracking financial patterns. "You've trained him well," David observed one evening. "He thinks like an investigator." "He thinks like someone who wants to protect his community," I corrected. "The best defense comes from understanding what needs defending." Our reputation spread. Other towns facing corporate pressure sent representatives seeking advice. We shared our methods carefully, teaching them to build their own resistance networks disguised as normal community activities. Clara Richardson returned a month later, this time dropping her friendly facade. "You're causing problems, Mrs. Parker. Serious people are taking notice." "Serious people should notice when communities stand together," I replied calmly. "Saves everyone time and trouble. The mining consortiums will not be denied," she warned. "What happened with Apache mining was a minor setback. The real power in this territory hasn't even flexed its muscles yet." Perhaps they should ask themselves, "Why?" Sarah Cooper suggested, appearing with another group of students. "Why one small town's resistance has inspired so many others?" Clara's eyes narrowed at the children practicing their arithmetic, actually plotting corporate patrol patterns. "Teaching them young, I see. Every child should learn how their community works," Sarah smiled. "Don't you agree?" The threat in Clara's response was clear. Some lessons come at a very high price. After she left, Thomas helped me close the store, his movements showing the quiet confidence he'd developed. "She's scared," he observed, "not of you, but of what the town's become." "Smart observation," I praised him. "Fear makes people dangerous. The consortiums realize they're not just fighting one town anymore. They're fighting an idea," he finished. "Like you taught me. Once people stop being afraid, start working together, they become unstoppable." I completed the lesson. That evening, our regular strategy meeting included representatives from 3 neighboring towns. They'd come to learn our methods, but they brought valuable information about corporate movements. "They're consolidating forces," Judge Harrison analyzed the reports, "preparing for something bigger than individual pressure tactics." Martha Jenkins' banking contacts confirmed this assessment. Major financial movements happening in Denver. "The consortiums are pooling resources, coordinating efforts." "Good," David Harrison surprised everyone. "Let them gather their strength in one place. Makes them easier to expose." He was right. The bigger their operation grew, the more people involved, the more likely someone would talk. Margaret's telegraph network had already identified 3 potential informants within corporate ranks. "Winter's coming," Rebecca Foster noted. "They'll want to move before the passes close. Whatever they're planning will happen soon." Sarah Cooper's students had noticed increased activity around corporate holdings. "More men are arriving daily," she reported. "Not just lawyers and agents now, professional gunmen trying to look respectable. They'll try to provoke an incident," I predicted, "something to justify massive retaliation, make an example of us." "Let them try," Martha Jenkins said firmly. "They'll find this town isn't what they think." As if to emphasize her point, a group of women crossed the street outside, appearing to share gossip. Actually, they were our newly trained security patrol, checking corporate watch points. "They see what they expect to see," Thomas observed. "Just like you taught me about misdirection in chess." The mining consortiums would learn this lesson too late. They were preparing to crush a small town's rebellion, not realizing they faced something far more powerful, an idea spreading across the territory, taking root in countless communities. Every attempt to suppress us only proved our point. Together, organized and prepared, ordinary people could stand against seemingly unstoppable forces. The storm was coming, but this time we weren't just ready to weather it. We were prepared to change its course entirely. Winter descended on Willow Springs with unusual ferocity, but the mining consortium's forces arrived despite the bitter cold. They came in waves, first the lawyers with their injunctions and court orders, then the Pinkerton agents with their practiced intimidation, and finally the gunmen, no longer bothering to hide their intentions. Margaret Wilson's telegraph clicked urgently one frozen morning. "Large force departing Denver, stop. Heading south through Mountain Pass. Stop corporate directors accompanying stop. Estimated arrival 2 days. Stop." I studied the message while Thomas practiced his shooting in the store's basement range we'd constructed. His accuracy had improved remarkably, though I prayed he'd never need those skills. "They're coming in force," David Harrison confirmed, snow dusting his coat as he entered. "My scouts counted 50 riders, heavily armed. They're bringing portable printing presses, legal documents, even a judge." Planning to make it all look official, Judge Harrison nodded grimly. "Seize the town through legal means while having overwhelming force to crush any resistance." Sarah Cooper arrived with fresh intelligence gathered by her students. They've recruited 3 former territorial marshals, giving their operation a veneer of law enforcement legitimacy. The pieces aligned exactly as we'd predicted. The consortiums would attempt to take the town through seemingly legal means, backed by overwhelming force. Any resistance would be branded as criminal activity, justifying whatever violence they employed. "Time to activate everything we've prepared," I decided. "Send the signals." Within hours, our carefully crafted plans sprang into motion. Martha Jenkins's banking network froze corporate accounts across 3 territories, citing suspicious activities requiring investigation. Rebecca Foster's sewing circle activated. Their information network spreading warnings and coordinating responses. Thomas watched the activity with keen understanding, like chess pieces moving into position before the final game. "Exactly," I smiled, proud of how he'd grown. "But remember, the pieces they see aren't always the ones that matter most." The consortium's force arrived at dawn, 2 days later, their approach heralded by the crunch of hooves on frozen ground. Their leader was a surprise, Clara Richardson herself, now dressed in practical riding clothes that didn't quite hide the derringer at her belt. "Mrs. Parker," she called out, her voice carrying across the silent street, "we bring legal authority to restore order to this rebellious district. Surrender peacefully, and no one needs to be hurt." I stepped onto my store's porch, aware of the watching eyes, both hostile and friendly, tracking every movement. "Interesting definition of legal authority, Mrs. Richardson. Does it include the forged documents in your saddlebags or the falsified court orders your judge signed?" Her composure cracked slightly. "You can't possibly know about those?" I smiled. "Like you didn't know we had copies of your organization's real books? The ones showing bribes, illegal seizures, and planned accidents across the territory?" The former marshals with her shifted uneasily. They hadn't signed up for obvious criminality. "Enough games," Clara snapped. "We have overwhelming force. Your little town's resistance ends today." "Look around, Mrs. Richardson. Really look." She did, and I saw the moment realization struck. The quiet street wasn't empty. Women chatted on porches with rifles casually propped nearby. Children played games that gave them perfect observation posts. Shopkeepers went about business while maintaining clear fields of fire. More importantly, dozens of riders approached from the north, representatives from other towns we'd helped organize, coming to stand with us. "You see a small town," I continued. "We see a community. You count your gunmen. We count our neighbors. You measure your strength in money and bullets. We measure ours in determination and unity." "Pretty words," she scoffed. "But words don't stop bullets." "No," I agreed. "But federal marshals do." David Harrison stepped forward, badge gleaming. "Clara Richardson, you and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and about 40 other charges we've documented extensively." Her gun cleared its holster with impressive speed. "You're outnumbered, Marshal." "Am I?" He smiled as badges flashed throughout the crowd. Deputized townspeople we'd trained, legitimate law officers from neighboring communities, even a few of her own men who'd agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. "You still don't understand what you're facing," I told her. "This isn't just one town's resistance. It's a revolution in how communities protect themselves. Every person you see has been trained, organized, and prepared, not just to fight, but to build something stronger than your corruption. The mining consortiums will not be denied, she insisted, but her voice wavered. We have power you can't imagine. Had power, Thomas spoke up unexpectedly, his clear voice carrying conviction. Before people stopped being afraid, before they learned to stand together, Clara's composure finally cracked. Kill them all, she screamed, raising her derringer. What followed wasn't the bloodbath she'd hoped for. Our preparations had been too thorough, our organization too complete. Her men found themselves surrounded, outmaneuvered by townspeople who knew every angle and alley. I took Clara myself, not with violence, but with the skills I'd learned as a marshal, anticipating her moves, redirecting her anger, letting her own desperation defeat her. When the smoke cleared, not a single life had been lost. The consortium's force surrendered to superior organization and determination. Their documents revealing decades of corruption were already spreading across telegraph wires to newspapers throughout the territory. What happens now? Thomas asked as we watched the prisoners being processed. Now the real work begins, I told him. Building something that will last. Teaching other towns to protect themselves, creating connections strong enough that no one can break them. David Harrison approached, looking both proud and thoughtful. The governor wants to establish a new kind of law enforcement, communities protecting themselves, working together, sharing information and resources. He's asking for help setting it up. Let me guess, I smiled. He'd like Lightning Hand Emily to come out of retirement? Actually, he grinned, he'd like Emily Parker, the shopkeeper who turned a town's resistance into a territorial revolution. Your methods, training communities, organizing networks, teaching people to defend themselves while appearing harmless, they're more valuable than any fast gun. Thomas absorbed this with characteristic perception. We'd still live here, right? Still run the store? Of course, I assured him. But we'd also help other towns learn what we've learned, build something bigger than just one community's defense. The sun broke through winter clouds as we walked home, casting long shadows across snow-covered streets. Women gathered in Rebecca Foster's shop, already planning how to strengthen their networks. Sarah Cooper's students practiced their arithmetic, learning to calculate supply routes and coordinate communications. Mom, Thomas said thoughtfully, remember when you first taught me chess? You said sometimes the most powerful pieces aren't the ones that look strongest. Like a town of shopkeepers and housewives defeating a mining consortium's army. I smiled. Like a widow with a secret past teaching people to protect themselves, he corrected. The best moves are the ones nobody sees coming. He was right. Lightning. And Emily's legacy wouldn't be her speed with a gun, but her role in teaching communities to stand together against corruption. The quiet widow's resistance had sparked something more powerful than any weapon, the unshakable strength of people united against injustice. Winter settled over Willow Springs, but it brought no silence. The town hummed with activity. People, training, organizing, strengthening connections with neighboring communities. What had started as one town's defense had grown into something unprecedented in the territory. David Harrison submitted his report to the governor that evening. Have witnessed the future of law enforcement in the West, not lone gunmen or corrupt corporations, but communities, organized to protect themselves. Recommend immediate implementation of Parker methodology across territory. I added my own note. The days of solving problems with fast guns are ending. The future belongs to those who build connections, who teach others to resist corruption, who transform fear into strength through unity. As night fell, I watched Thomas practicing his observation skills, identifying corporate agents by their subtle tells. He'd inherited my strategic mind, but added his own wisdom, understanding that true strength comes from helping others find their power. Ready for a new adventure? I asked him. He smiled, showing that quiet confidence he'd developed. Ready to help others learn what we learned? To build something bigger than just our town? Exactly. The mining consortiums had tried to break one town's spirit. Instead, they'd helped create a movement that would transform the entire territory. Their corruption had forced us to innovate, to develop methods of resistance that made traditional power meaningless. Lightning Hand. Emily was no longer just a legend from the past. She'd evolved into something more powerful, a symbol of how communities could protect themselves against seemingly overwhelming forces. The winter wind carried whispers of change across the territory. In every town facing corporate pressure, people were learning, organizing, preparing. They didn't need fast guns or lone heroes. They needed knowledge, unity, and the unshakable strength that comes from standing together. Willow Springs had shown the way. Now we would help others follow, building something stronger than corruption, more lasting than greed, more powerful than any weapon. The storm had passed, but its effects would echo through history, not as a tale of gunfights and violence, but as a story of how ordinary people discovered their collective strength and changed their world forever, and that was a legacy worth more than all the silver in the territory. A week after the confrontation, representatives from 20 towns gathered in Willow Springs Church. They came seeking not just knowledge, but understanding of how a small community had transformed itself into something powerful enough to defeat corporate might. Start with the children, Sarah Cooper explained to the assembled teachers. They see everything, understand more than adults expect, teach them to observe, analyze, share information through simple codes and games. Rebecca Foster unrolled quilts that mapped supply routes and safe houses. Beauty hides function, she demonstrated. Every stitch tells a story, every pattern carries meaning. Your women's groups become your intelligence network. Martha Jenkins shared banking records, showing how financial resistance could be coordinated. Money follows patterns, she explained. Learn to read those patterns, disrupt them, create alternative systems that can't be controlled by outside interests. The meeting lasted 3 days, with each aspect of our defense network explained and adapted for other communities. I watched Thomas moving among the visitors, sharing insights with their children, teaching them the games that had helped him. Understand strategy and resistance. The boy's a natural teacher, David Harrison observed, like his mother, seeing not just what people are, but what they could become. Clara Richardson's trial began the following week. The evidence we'd gathered proved devastating, not just to the mining consortiums, but to corrupt officials throughout the territory. Each revelation sparked new investigations, new exposures of corporate manipulation. They never understood their real weakness, Judge Harrison commented, as another corporation's illegal activities came to light. They thought power came from money and violence. They never saw that their greatest vulnerability was their own arrogance. The governor's office began implementing what they called the Parker Protocol, communities organized for mutual defense and support, sharing information and resources through networks disguised as ordinary social connections. What had started as one town's resistance became a model for territorial governance, but not everyone celebrated these changes. Corporate interests launched a counter-campaign, trying to paint our methods as dangerous vigilantism. They found themselves facing not angry gunslingers, but school teachers presenting documented evidence, bankers revealing financial crimes, housewives exposing corporate conspiracies. They're still fighting the last war, Thomas observed, as we read newspaper accounts of failed corporate retaliation attempts. Still thinking in terms of guns and guards while we've changed the whole game. He was right. Every attempt to disrupt our networks only strengthened them. When they pressured telegraph operators, our message systems shifted to traveling merchants and church groups. When they tried to control banks, local lending circles expanded. When they threatened violence, they found entire communities prepared to document and expose their actions. Margaret Wilson's telegraph network evolved into something more sophisticated, a web of communication that could route messages through multiple channels, ensuring no single point of failure could disrupt the flow of information. "Think of it as a river," she explained to operators from other towns. "Block one stream and the water finds new paths. Our strength isn't in any single method, but in our ability to adapt and flow around obstacles." The women's groups became particularly effective. Corporate agents, trained to watch for armed resistance, consistently overlooked the real sources of community power. Church socials, sewing circles, school meetings all became venues for coordinating defense and sharing intelligence. "It's almost embarrassing," Rebecca Foster smiled during one such gathering. "They're so focused on looking for weapons, they never notice the real arsenal: knowledge, organization, unity. Even the children adapted our methods in unexpected ways." Thomas and his friends developed new games that taught observation and strategy, spreading them to other towns through normal childhood interactions. Each game contained lessons about resistance and community defense, passed along in ways no adult authority could easily detect or disrupt. "Remember when you first taught me chess?" Thomas asked one evening as we closed the store. "You said the most powerful moves are often the quietest. And now you're teaching others the same lesson," I nodded proudly. "But with games you've created yourself." The Territorial Marshal's office underwent its own transformation. David Harrison's new training program emphasized community integration over individual action. Deputies learned to work with local networks, to understand that true law enforcement meant supporting community self-defense rather than imposing external control. "The old way is dying," he told a graduating class of deputies. "The lone lawman, the fast gun, the simple solutions, they belong to yesterday. Tomorrow belongs to communities that protect themselves through organization and unity." Willow Springs itself continued evolving. My store became a hub for more than just supplies. It offered training in community defense disguised as ordinary business seminars. The shooting range in the basement served its purpose, but the real education happened in discussions about strategy, organization, and resistance techniques. Sarah Cooper's school earned territorial recognition for academic excellence, though its real achievements went beyond traditional education. She developed methods for teaching resistance that could be integrated into standard curricula, spreading them through educational conferences and teacher exchanges. "Every lesson carries two meanings," she explained to visiting educators. "The surface knowledge that authorities expect, and the deeper understanding that communities need." The mining consortiums made one final attempt at retaliation. They tried to pressure the territorial government into passing laws restricting community organizations. Their effort backfired spectacularly when our networks exposed the bribes they'd offered to legislators. "They still don't understand," Martha Jenkins observed as the conspirators faced prosecution. "Their weapons are money and force. Ours are truth and unity. They're fighting shadows while we change the fundamental nature of power in the territory." Spring arrived with news that similar networks were forming in neighboring territories. Communities, facing corporate pressure, reached out for guidance, sent representatives to learn our methods. What had started as one town's desperate defense became a movement transforming the entire frontier. "You've started something remarkable," David Harrison told me during his last visit. "Not just a new way of fighting corruption, but a new way of building community strength." Thomas, overhearing this, added his own insight. "Mom always said the best defense isn't about weapons or walls. It's about people working together, watching out for each other, staying strong through unity." The mining consortium's influence gradually waned, replaced by more legitimate enterprises that had to operate within communities rather than trying to control them. Some corporate leaders adapted, learning to work with local networks rather than against them. Others faded into history, their power broken by the very people they'd tried to dominate. But the real victory wasn't in defeating any single opponent. It was in creating something lasting, a way for communities to protect themselves while growing stronger together. The networks we'd built, the methods we'd developed, the unity we'd fostered, these would outlast any individual battle. As summer approaches, I watched Thomas teaching younger children the observation games he'd created. Each lesson contained elements of strategy and resistance, passed along in ways that made them seem like simple play. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when you first started teaching me these things, I thought it was just about staying safe. Now I understand it's about making sure everyone knows how to stay safe together." That evening, as the setting sun painted Willow Springs in shades of gold, I reflected on how far we'd come. Lightning hand. Emily's fast gun had started our journey, but Emily Parker's legacy would be something far more powerful. A way for ordinary people to stand together against injustice, protecting their communities through unity and organization, rather than violence. The Old West was changing. The days of lone gunfighters and simple solutions were passing. But what replaced them was something stronger. Communities bound together by shared purpose and mutual support, capable of defending themselves against any threat through the power of collective action and organized resistance. That was a revolution, worth more than all the gold in the territory, a legacy that would echo through generations to come. And it started with a widow and her son, teaching a town to transform fear into strength through unity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.